So as you're looking to spend maybe money on your first watch, or maybe even are just trying to expand your collection, I think having $1,000 budget is a serious amount of money, but also opens up a wide variety of watches available to you. And even for $1,000 or less, there are watches out there that I would classify as iconic. We use this term a lot in watchmaking, but these, I think, in this list here today are going to be worthy of that title. So we have a list of some of the most iconic watches that you can get under $1,000. So an icon, we throw around this term very loosely, so let's establish a definition first. It's a person or thing regarded as a representative symbol or as worthy of veneration. But beyond that, what I also want to really dig into is what I am referring to as an icon. I am not thinking about what are the best watches under $1,000, even though some of these watches on this list might qualify for that, or watches that present the greatest of value. What I'm looking for is a few different other points. So one, are they historically impactful? Secondly, is it a legendary design, or has it helped establish design styles going forward? And then finally, is it influential, both to collectors, the industry, and even beyond that, pop culture? So if you have ever wanted to work in the watch industry, now might be your chance. So we have some new positions available within our content team with writing, working with other team members and myself, creating great content across YouTube, Instagram, as well as on our website. If you are interested, head to our careers page, see what we have available, but also be sure to send your resume to careers@teddybaldassarre.com. All of these are full-time positions, come with a full salary, PTO, 401k match, health, vision, dental coverage. Send us an email if you are interested with your resume. In addition, we also have roles that are not current needs for our business, but if you are interested in sending over your resume, we'd absolutely love to see them as well. Check out more information in the description down below. So to kick us off, we look at the most inexpensive watch on this list, and a watch that I would say is the most iconic watch that you could probably buy under $25, or at least right there with another watch from this brand, but this is the Casio F91W. This was a watch that was introduced in 1989, and it has become a legend of affordability, now spanning generations of collectors. Looking for your first watch? I think you look in the direction of this and you're met with a nice resin embrace. This watch represents so many collectors in their initial journey. People that don't have a lot of money to spend, and you look at what the cost of a carton of eggs are nowadays, and then you look what the cost of this watch is, it becomes even more endearing. Probably the most inexpensive watch in the world that still gets kudos from collectors from all walks of life. It's certainly a small watch, 33.5 millimeters for its case size, lug to lug of 37.5 millimeters, but it's resilient, it's tough, it has functions to go along with it, and it's about as timeless as you can get for a digital watch. For the next piece on this list is another inexpensive Casio. We have to throw a few of these out here. You probably could mention others, but these are two that spring to mind immediately. This is the Casio A168. This watch is basically taking many of the same formula that we saw with the F91W, adding a steel case. Also looks back to those early Casiotrons of the early 1970s. Compact lug-to-lug, LCD display, multiple functions. You also have a gold version if you wanted to go that route. This is also probably one of the most inexpensive watches where you can get a steel bracelet to go along with it. Now, is that steel bracelet going to be comfortable on the wrist? Give or take, maybe depending on what kind of day we're talking about and how much hair you have on your wrist. A little bit larger with its case size at 35.4 millimeters and 38.5 millimeters lug to lug. It quotes water resistance of 30 meters, and I don't want to be the guy that says that you can go way deeper with these, but you probably can go way deeper than these. And if you do break it, it's $30. So this next watch is one that I don't think many people consider enough as an icon that it is and what it was able to do for the broader industry. The industry would not be the same if it wasn't for this watch. This is the Glycine Airman. Look back to the 1950s. What do we think of oftentimes with 1950s watchmaking? Yes, we think of the dive watch craze, but another watch type that I would say was popularized during this era was the GMT. This watch laid the framework for a lot of the design style that would become the common accepted idea of how you display two different time zones, with a bezel with 24-hour display. Back in December of 1953, Glycine registered a patent for its 24-hour rotating bezel and locking crown. This changed watchmaking forever, and we saw many different brands take up this design in years to follow. At the time of the release, the watch cost $59.95, around $700 in today's money, and depending on where you look, the distribution is pretty messy for these watches. You can get into Glycine watches, and Glycine Airman at that, for around this price. Further, these watches were worn during the Vietnam War and available at many PXs. Also, a set was purchased by the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. So the aviation inspiration from the beginning, the request came from actually a client of Glycine that was talking about all these functions that they would want to have when they are traveling across different time zones. And Glycine answered very shortly thereafter with this watch, forever changing the way that 24-hour and GMT watches were presented going forward. This is easily one of the most iconic watches you can get for under $1,000, looking next to the field watch design for the Hamilton Khaki Field Mechanical. I would say the best watch that represents what we're getting into when we're trying to classify iconic is the hand-winding mechanical option, just because it looks back to what this brand is most known for, those hand-winding manual watches produced for the Allied forces during World War II and beyond that, looking into the middle of the 20th century. Hamilton has a history dating back to 1892 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where they were at the center of American watchmaking, which at the time of their genesis was really leading the way when it came to scaling production. Many Swiss brands were coming over to the United States to see what brands like a Waltham and a Hamilton were doing and how they were able to scale production the way that they were. Now, Hamilton was very important to the gradual distribution of railway chronometers, but really where they started to gain even more stride was during World War II, where they scaled production dramatically. They did this so much so that they had to cease production of standard consumer grade watches, so they can ensure they were producing enough watches for the war effort. If we didn't have the watches produced by Hamilton, Marathon, as well as brands like a Bulova and many others, the fate of the world might be a bit different. Now, Hamilton is no longer based in Switzerland, but you're getting a Swiss-made movement on the inside, 38mm case, 9.5mm thickness, lug-to-lug of 47mm, and a watch that is truly timeless. So there are a lot of Seiko watches that you could include as icons, but I'm going to actually start with a chronograph. And this is the Seiko Speed Timer. When we think back to the 1960s, especially the late 1960s, there's a lot going on. You had the introduction of the Seiko Astron, which basically changed the trajectory of the entire industry for the following next 2 decades. But another important moment in watchmaking that happened in the same year was the production of automatic chronographs. This happened with the likes of Zenith with their El Primero, Heuer, Breitling, and Hamilton collaborating on different projects. And then also in 1969, Seiko unveiled their Speed Timer 6139. This was among the first automatic chronographs ever to be produced. And Seiko has basically brought these watches back. Now, they're not mechanical, but they fall in a great price range, under $1,000. You get a taste of history, and you're able to get some nice everyday wearability in the process. You have a couple different case sizes for these watches. One I'm gonna be mentioning here is 39mm, 45.5mm lug-to-lug, still getting 100 meters of water resistance. Solar quartz movement on the inside. So you're combining solar power on the inside, quartz oscillation, and some of the sweep of a mechanical looking watch. So brings a lot to the table, looks the part, has the history to go along with it. Speed Timer is one of the most important chronographs of all time. It deserves to be on a list like this. So another watch that comes from this era is also a chronograph, but connects on a totally different idea. Was not scaled to the same production. The watch that this is based on was really just a standard prototype watch. It was not made for consumers at all, except for one gentleman named David Scott. Now, this is the Bulova lunar pilot. So as the story goes, NASA astronaut David Scott, during the Apollo 15 mission, wore a lunar pilot, or what at the time was just a Bulova moonwatch chronograph, didn't have this lunar pilot name, wore it in 1971. Making this one of the few watches to ever actually make it on the moon's surface. What also added to the story is that this was not a watch that was given to David Scott as part of his kit. All of NASA astronauts were given kit and watches that were directly owned by NASA, which also added to the story since this watch went up for auction about a decade ago and sold for $1.625 million following all the buyer's fees. The modern day Bulova Lunar Pilot provides a lot of the same look and feel as the original. You have 2 different case sizes here. Last year we saw the unveiling of the 43.5mm, which probably has more mass appeal. 13.2mm in thickness, lug-to-lug of 51mm, and water resistance of 50 meters. Also high precision quartz movement on the inside, so this will oscillate 8 times more than a conventional quartz crystal, making this watch ridiculously accurate. Now we jump back to Casio, looking at the G-Shock, and I struggled to try to figure out what are 2 G-Shocks that come to mind first, but the one that really springs to mind before any others is the 5600 series. You can look at the 5610, but I think the DW 5600 is a watch that I would say is the most iconic with its case size because it looks back to the original. You look back to 1983 with the DW 5000C. This really stemmed and created one of the most important watches of all time, selling millions and millions and millions. It said that there's been over 100 million G-Shocks sold since its creation in the early 1980s, and I would imagine it might be even more than that. This watch has an ability to touch the hearts of collectors, but also be at the center of pop culture in many different instances. You'll see it on the likes of Navy SEALs, you'll see it on the wrists of dads out there everywhere, law enforcement. This watch transcends any era. It is as iconic as you're going to come across. It doesn't matter its price. This is a watch that still, even to this day, is so important for the industry. And this is a watch that will remain an icon for as long as we remain on this earth. And then the other watch that I'll mention here, very similar in terms of its importance, but presenting another case, this is the Casio G-Shock DW9052. So this takes a different silhouette, taking away from that square rectangular style that we saw with the 5600, having more of an oversized silhouette. Also has this recessed crystal design and is going to look different than many other G-Shocks. The lugs on this model actually sit on a hinge, more like a traditional watch, and also really is accommodating for smaller wrists. This is a watch that was issued to US Navy SEALs for years and also was worn by law enforcement as well. So for this next watch, this really, honestly, I don't think I would be in front of camera if it wasn't for this watch. This changed the entire industry. Your interest in watches might not be what it is now if it wasn't for these watches. In 1983, the industry was not what it was in the 1960s. It was a shell of its former self. It shrunk by 2/3 in its size in terms of total employment in less than 2 decades. And this was a result of the quartz crisis. Japanese watchmaking comes in and decimates the Swiss watch industry, where mechanical watchmaking, all this infrastructure that was created around producing these watches, basically became obsolete overnight, leaving people out of work and many of these beloved brands falling under. But then at the genius of Nicholas Hayek Sr., he was able to identify a trend and also a design that would become one of the most important in all of watchmaking. The swatch. If you talk to any collector that was around in the 1980s, they will always seem to reference swatch and how they loved collecting these things when they started to make themselves available. It was a perfect response to what was happening with the watch industry, and Nicholas Hayek Sr. was able to take what was happening with the swatch and all the successful selling that was happening there, and was able to continue to develop some of these brands that had fallen under and preserve the element of watchmaking that so much of us, I think, we love. And also was responsible for the eventual creation of the Swatch Group, which I would argue is probably the most important brand in watchmaking because it spans the likes of Swatch all the way up to Breguet. There's no other group in all of the industry that has this amount of spread and distribution. You see a lot of luxury brands and conglomerates, but there are very few like the Swatch Group. For the next watch on this list, we look at a design style that this is not exclusive to this brand, but under $1,000, you struggle to find another brand with the heritage of this one that actually provides it at this price point. Here we're looking at Laco with their Augsburg as well as their Aachen. If you look back to World War II, one of the most popular designs was the Flieger. It was inspirational for many different brands, and there was an original 5 brands that were producing these during World War II. Those included Stova, Lange, IWC, Vempi, and Laco. Now, Laco nowadays is a German company, but what they've been able to do with some of their watches is make them affordable, under $500 thanks to using Japanese calibers on the inside. So you have a Type A and a Type B style dial. So you have the Augsburg and then the Aachen. So Type B, I'll talk about that one first because I find this very interesting. You'll find some of the characteristics of these watches that were designed directly for pilots and navigators. The Type B was for navigators, and what they needed to be able to do was look at the minutes on the outside of the dial very quickly. So that's why you'll see this large set of numerals on the outside with the minutes, so they can do this at a glance. Type A was very simple in its orientation, and that orientation was very important as well. You look at that triangle at 12 o'clock, that is what it is used for. At a quick glance, you know exactly where you are. You don't know what is going on in these crazy airspaces. Things are changing very rapidly, so you need to be able to always, at a quick glance, know what time it is. These are some of the most important watches ever created. There was a variety of brands that were producing them, but Laco stands alone as being the one that has these at the most affordable prices. Now you return to the Seiko 5 collection. I am not going to get into all the Seiko 5s, but the concept of the Seiko 5 is one of the most iconic watches of all time, without question. So back in 1963, Seiko unveiled the Seiko Sportsmatic 5. This established many of the design codes that would now become what the Seiko 5 is, even to this day. They were self-winding, had day-date displays, had to be water resistant. The crown at the 4 o'clock position was a typical thing you would see, and it also had a rugged case design. And beyond that, these watches also established an important DNA and idea that still remains to this day. And this is why so many enthusiasts and younger collectors love the Seiko 5. It's a gateway into watchmaking. And now it spans a wide variety of different styles. We have GMTs galore, dive style watches, everyday, field, and then countless limited editions to go on top of it all. Now, when we think of some of the most influential dive watches of the last 30 to 40 years, there's a lot that come to mind, but this is one that probably isn't mentioned enough. This is the Citizen Fugu ProMaster Diver. So Citizen was a pioneer for dive watch design. They were the producer of the first titanium watch and also produced some of the early professional dive watches that were coming out of Japan. Now this design comes from a 1989 style watch known as the Fugu, or in Japanese refers to pufferfish, which commonly you'll find on the case back of many of these watches. These watches have serious credibility amongst divers across the world and were also used by the Italian Navy Special Forces unit. Citizen updated these in 2018 and then eventually rolled them out to the US market in 2022. Legitimate dive heritage here, ISO certification to go along with it, amazing lume and legibility across the board, Miyota calibers on the inside, and one of the most recognizable designs in dive watch history. And now speaking of most recognizable designs in dive watch history, you have to talk about the Seiko Turtle. The Turtle in many ways was the precursor for other legends that we would find from Seiko, including something like the SKX. Looking back to the 6309 Turtle DNA that was established in 1976, so much of what we saw from that watch and some of these early Turtle references were crucial in developing some of the standards that we now associate with Seiko dive watches and dive watches in general. The wearability of these watches with those cushion style cases and how it wears on the wrist is very Seiko. The 4 o'clock crown position, now there were other brands that were playing around with this, but I would say Seiko was so important in popularizing this design trait. The hand markings and how the dial was displayed was also crucial to the Turtle's design, and even to this day, the Turtle is one of the most recognizable cases for any dive watch out there. But all right, guys, that's my list here today, looking at some of the most iconic watches for under $1,000. I probably could even include some more, but I'd rather be more selective than include even more pieces here. But maybe we save this for a future installment. If you'd like me to do another one of these, give this video a thumbs up. That's a great indicator. Also, what do you think is the most iconic watch that you can get for under $1,000? Leave a comment down below. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.